Okay, so we're going to forge on with our last panel, which will be a wide-ranging discussion of what happened and what do we do moving forward in a short phrase. We're privileged to have a group of migration experts who have been leaders in the field for multiple years, and they come at it from different perspectives. So it'll help us get a clear picture of all aspects of the immigration system. I'll give a quick introduction. You have their bios in your folders, so I'm going to abbreviate my introductions. Our first speaker is going to be Archbishop Thomas Wenski of Miami, who's been the Archbishop of Miami since 2010, how time flies, appointed by Pope Benedict XVI. And Archbishop Wenski is a voice for migrants, I would say not only in South Florida, but throughout Latin America. A huge defender of immigrant rights and especially of the rights of Haitian migrants over the years. So, Archbishop, welcome. Our second speaker is going to be Angela Kelley, who is a senior advisor to the American Immigration Lawyers Association, but I was going to say has been a leader in this field for a few decades. And Angie and I have been through a few of the immigration wars over the years. She was deputy director of the National Immigration Forum for 16 years, and she was vice president for immigration policy at the Center for American Progress. So welcome, Angie. Our third speaker will be Dylan Corbett, who is the executive director of the Hope Border Institute in El Paso, Texas. It's a nonprofit advocacy and service organization. Dylan has really become a leading voice on behalf of migrants and asylum seekers at the border, particularly as the immigration debate has focused on the border in recent years. Dylan's voice has been very important to the rights of migrants on the border. So we welcome Dylan. We also should have Lee Gelernt coming on. I don't know if anyone's on. He's the deputy director of the ACLU Migrant Rights Project, and Lee is the lead litigator for ACLU and has been very active in both the first Trump administration and the Biden administration against bad enforcement policies. So hopefully Lee will join us soon. But we'll start with the Archbishop. And Archbishop, if you could give us your wisdom and perhaps some hope moving forward, we would appreciate it.
Well, Randy McGordy said that the governor called me a liar. Actually, it was his press secretary, which I guess is about the same thing, right? But a few years ago, I was on the Steve Colbert show when Pope Francis was in New York. I was invited to be a guest on his show, and I started talking to Colbert about when I'm in Miami, I like to tease the Cubans because I can speak Spanish with a Cuban accent, and I tell them what street in Cuba, in Havana, I was born in, and they believe me. And so Colbert said to me, "Archbishop, do you lie often?" And I said, "Only when I can get away with it." Well, I like to tell people that the best thing about Miami is that it's so close to the United States. And you can drink the water. But in Miami-Dade County, there's a city called AILA, and it's the least diverse city in the United States. The least diverse city in the United States. It's 99% Hispanic. And it voted 75% for Donald Trump. One of the earlier panelists said that, he's going to deport the criminals, but we're not criminals, so he's not going to deport us. I think that's something, also, something that we have to, be careful of, because the narrative out there is that they're all criminals. All these illegal aliens or illegal immigrants are criminals. But they're not all criminals, because, being in the country without legal status is mostly a civil violation. In some cases, it could be a criminal violation, but in most cases, it's a civil violation. So just like you're not a criminal because you made a right turn on red when it was against the law. You broke the law, you pay a fine, and you're not a criminal for that. So because it was a civil, not a criminal infraction of the law. And so most of these people in this country are not criminals. It's not criminals. And I think the administration has to be reminded about that as they look forward or look towards this mass deportation. Now, as you know, President Trump likes to speak in hyperbole. And so this issue about mass deportation is probably another example of his Trumpian hyperbole. But he also speaks in hyperbole about the economy, that he's going to make the biggest economy ever, ever, ever. Well, hopefully he will try to enact that hyperbole and make it a reality. But if he does, he's not going to be able to do it unless he makes some kind of accommodation on immigration. And so I think that's the silver lining on this. If you remember a couple of weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal reported on their meeting with Trump. And he said something like, well, I can't talk nice because if I talk nice, more people will come. But at the same time, he admitted the issue is very complex. And he says there are a lot of good people and I want to help them. And so let's hope that's true, and let's help him act on that sentiment if it's at all sincere on his part. But that's what we have to do is to work towards that effort so that he can make that economy boom as he promises. Basically, I think he's going to go after the low-hanging fruit. Now, there's been deportations going on for a long time. Bush, in 8 years, deported about 2 million people. Obama deported more. He was the deporter-in-chief. Remember we used to call him that, deporter-in-chief? He deported about 2.5 million people. And I remember being in Mexico in 2016 before the conventions when he was nominated, and the American ambassador in Mexico, and I can't remember right now how many he told me, but it was hundreds of thousands, I think, of children that are American citizens living in Mexico because they went back with their parents. So, mass deportation has been part of our history here for a number of years, and so we, there'll always be some deportation going on. I think that's why the congressman was very good in trying to build a bridge between the two parties on a sensible reaction to it. But going back to those Hispanics in AILA that voted 75% for Trump, the Republicans for years have been saying that they're willing to address a pathway to citizenship, but first we have to get control of the border. Unless the border is taken care of, they're not going to address the other issue. They've been saying that for years. Marco Rubio, the soon-to-be Secretary of State, several years back, he was part of the Gang of Eight that had fashioned an immigration reform. And the reform was very interesting because it provided a path for citizenship, but it was going to take the person that benefited from it 13 years to become a permanent resident. 13 years. And I think that was deliberately designed because none of the Republicans wanted these people to be voting against them. Because they assumed, and you hear it every once in a while on the Fox News and everything, that the Democrats want all these immigrants here because they're going to become Democrats and vote the Democrats in office ad perpetuum. Well, this election proved that that's not necessarily true. And so that's another good thing, or maybe not a good thing, but a silver lining that right now the Republicans don't have to be afraid of immigrants becoming citizens because they have a chance of winning their votes equally as well as the Democrats. In other words, both parties have to earn the votes of their voters. They have to earn the votes of their voters. And so that might create a new momentum in Congress where Republicans that might have been a little bit hesitant about moving towards a pathway to citizenship might now be able to be convinced once the border is under control, once the quote-unquote chaos of the border, and that's a debatable point, but once, at least in their mind, it's been settled. Now, the gentleman that talked about registry, I think this is something very important to us. For example, that was a provision of the 1924 law, which was a very anti-immigrant law. But my father benefited from that because he came from Poland in 1910, and he was able to become a legal resident and eventually a citizen through the registry. And that registry said basically that if you were in the country by a date certain, you could apply for legal permanent status and a pathway to citizenship. All you had to do is prove good moral character. The last time that date was, the date of registry was updated was 1973. And all you have to do is enact a law with about 7 or 8 words. The registry date is, and put it down, January 1st, 2014. 10 years, or 2015, make it 10 years from back. And if you do that, you'll take care of all the dreamers. You'll take care of most of the TPS people, you know, the historical TPS, the Salvadorians and the Hondurans, et cetera. You'll take care of about 10 million people right there. And if you do that, that means you release or you ease up the backlog on some of these these asylum claims, and then you work that through, and maybe you get a asylum system that's going to be functioning more efficiently, and therefore take that part of the brokenness out of the system. So I think I said all I should say at this point. So I think I'll sit down. But I remember in 1980, I was working with the Haitians in Miami. I was parish priest of Haitians for 18 years. I didn't say Mass in English for 18 years, only Haitian Creole. And in 1980, I would go on Wednesdays to Lantana, which is about 45 miles north of Miami, to celebrate Mass at a TB hospital that was being used as a overflow detention center for Haitians. And I'd say Mass there every Wednesday afternoon. I get there on one Wednesday, and all the Haitians are crying. They're all distressed. It was the day after the election. Reagan beat Carter, 1980. And I looked at them and I said, "What's wrong?" And they said, "Well, Reagan won, we're going to get deported." And I said to them, I said, "Come over here, look out the window." I said, "Now, what do you see here? What do you see out there that's different from what you saw yesterday?" And they looked around and they said, "Nothing." I said, "You mean it's all the same? Nothing's changed?" They said, "No, nothing's changed." I said, "Well, don't worry, nothing's going to change. You're not going to get deported." And they weren't deported. And it was actually Reagan that was in 1986 that voted the last amnesty that we've had that many years ago. So I think it shouldn't be all doom and gloom. It shouldn't be all doom and gloom. We should have some hope. And, you know, if somebody's digging a hole, and maybe the president-elect is digging a hole when he's talking about mass deportations, what we shouldn't do is help him dig the hole deeper. You know, we should try to talk to him, so that we can get him to listen to better angels and work out some type of a solution that will help everybody. Because again, most Americans are in favor of a pathway to legal citizenship. The polls have shown that. The polls got a little bit dicey when the border was seen to be out of control. If we get the border under control, there's possibility of real work. And if the president is smart, he might be crazy, but if he's smart, he'll do a pathway to citizenship.
Okay, I recognize I'm standing between you guys and happy hour. And it's been a long day, and the room is growing smaller and hotter, I think, by the moment. But there were just a couple simple questions that I thought I would put some answers on the table. One is, what happened? The other is, what will happen? And the third is, what can we do about it? So I'm going to just hit some very high-level comments. But I really want to get to Dylan and Lee, because these guys are like the real deal in terms of what happens on the ground and what happens in the courtrooms, and then really get your questions and then get you all to happy hour. So I am impressed that Better Angels and Trump was in the same sentence. That's great. You're doing the right job for you. I am definitely not doing that job. And I'm not so sure. I'm not so optimistic, and I'm just going to really lay it on the line for y'all. I was listening to a podcast this weekend, Freakonomics, and the guest was Fareed Zakaria, and he said that immigration is the rocket fuel of extreme Republican populism. It's a visible manifestation of what is changing in America that is making people really scared. They see chaos at the border. They're told about crimes by Trump and other Republicans. And the Democrats seem like they're looking the other way. They're not coming up with answers and taking it seriously. So I urge you to listen to that podcast. It almost caused me to go off the road because I was driving. But I think that there's a lot to be said there. So what did happen? What happened is that from the very beginning, that the Republicans and Trump controlled the narrative around the border, around immigration, and Biden is uncomfortable with this issue. We all know that, and he didn't know what to say and hasn't said much, and when he speaks up, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And many of the policies of this administration, which I served in day one as a senior counselor to Secretary Mayorkas, many of these policies require years and years and lots of money to get right, to manage migration in a way that works for this country. But guess what? We don't have years and years, because we have a record-breaking number of people that are coming to the southern border, or that were coming, certainly at the time he took office, because we have 4 failed nation states in this hemisphere. We've never had that before. We had the effects of a global economic downturn. We had the effects of COVID, on and on. You all know all that came together to create the chaos that this administration was unwilling to say, to use the word, we have a crisis. The other side had no problem addressing that, right? Facts don't matter. They're good about triggering feelings, and they're good at spending a lot of money. The Republicans spent nearly $1 billion on ads about immigration. Democrats spent, and let me make sure I get the number right, $107 million. $107 million. So they zeroed in on that issue, preying to people's fears, and we said virtually nothing. The second, so that's one element, right? They control the narrative. Second element, there's a failure on our side, writ large, to take on some uncomfortable truths. The uncomfortable truths are about the number of people coming, and that the smugglers have got an extraordinary network for getting people here. I saw it when I was in government, and you might remember when lots of Haitians moved like that on a dime to, oh my gosh, Del Rio, thank you. I was in government, we had no idea that was coming. That happened in a matter of hours, because the speed at which smugglers communicate with desperate migrants exceeds anything that we've been able to manage or to anticipate, right? That's beginning to change, but that's a reality. It's an uncomfortable truth. Lots of people, they're coming from around the world. It used to be that only 12% of people came from other parts of the world that wasn't like Mexico or the Northern Triangle. Now it's over 50%. So you've got different kinds of migrant streams. The second is the asylum backlog. People know that if they come, that they're probably going to get to come in and stay for a long time. Now, I represented asylum seekers. I know how hard it is. I know what it's like when you have a person who has been beaten, who has been raped, and who's scared to death to talk about that. And I'm telling my client, you need to talk about that. That's really hard. But that person in a 7-year backlog is not going to win asylum. So we are disadvantaging people who actually do have a well-founded fear of persecution. And we're advantaging people who just don't fit a narrow criteria and a narrow set of legal immigration options. And my heart breaks for them. But until we get real about the fact that folks are gaming the system to some extent, we're going to lose it entirely. That is the direction that we're on. Another uncomfortable truth is that there is a tension between established immigrants who've been here for a long time and recent arrivals. I work at AILA as a senior advisor. I helped facilitate EAD clinics here so people could get work authorization faster, and the immigration bar responded to it, and I was really proud of that. But you know what? There are a lot of immigrants that have been here for years and years, like the undocumented 500,000, is it, that are married to a U.S. citizen, and they don't have a work authorization. They can't get a work authorization. And you've got people, like Zachariah said in the podcast, I played by the rules. Anyway, how come they're getting a work authorization when I waited for 10 years to get a green card? It's on us to give answers to those questions. It's on us, and we haven't done it. So that's what I think happened. It's part of what happened. There's a lot more, obviously, but that's just a little slice. What do I think is going to happen? I think it's going to be bad, with all due respect. They have had time to prepare. They have had a transition team going for 4 years. It's called the Heritage Foundations Project 2025. Look it up if you haven't read it. It is their blueprint. And there were a lot of aspects of policy that Trump said about 2025. I don't support that. I don't support this. He never said that about their immigration plan. And even if he didn't have it, that's okay, because he has now in the White House Tom Homan and Steve Miller. And there's Trump. So it's like the devil, the Antichrist, I'm sorry if that's a weird thing to say in front of you, and Voldemort, that I can say. And so the White House will be the center of gravity. That is where the power will emanate in the Trump administration. I know that because I used to complain when I was at DHS that if we wanted to issue a press release, if we wanted to go to the bathroom, we had to get a pass from the White House, like they had to approve it. I mean, I think that those days will look like we once had a lot of authority. It's going to emanate from the White House, and you all know the ideology of those three people. Their efforts are going to be big and showy at first. I do think that they're going to arrest people with serious criminal records. I've seen the manifests on people going on planes that are going to be removed. They tell you exactly like what kind of crime they committed. So imagine that, right? Images of those guys getting boarded on planes, really scary guys, and then the victims, right? That were their victims. That's what we're going to see, big and showy. But we're also going to see like slow and insidious. So I learned today, I think I can share, I'm going to share, whatever. I learned today, this is terrifying, that the education transition team met with the Department of Education folks, right? So Trump's transition team meeting with folks in DOE now, and they're asking about, so can we look at the FAFSA forms to get information about people who may have undocumented parents? What kind of firewall do you have, and how quickly can we take that down? This is the Department of Education being asked by the Trump transition team. I'm not saying that's going to happen. Please don't repeat that. Please don't tweet it or whatever the hell people do on social media. But my point is that it's going to be different because they've been planning for it, and they have a roadmap for it. The last thing that we're going to see that's different is use of other parts of government, like I just described to you, the Department of Education. DHS, though, is a very big agency. CBP will turn inward, right? They're not so much at the border, but the resources of CBP will go into the United States. FEMA can help with, like, you know what they do, right? When there's a hurricane, they can help by setting up soft-sided facilities and moving people quickly with the help of TSA. So it's a use of government that we haven't seen before. I have to get some water. I'm so sorry. And then I'm going to stop talking. I really do promise.
Angie, could you just clarify what you meant by that? What
Yes.
FEMA would be doing? They're going to be like a detention?
So what does FEMA know how to do? Like you can imagine, right, when there's a hurricane? So imagine them doing that in the context of trying to round up lots of people and detain them until they can deport them.
So you're saying that they're going to be the ones doing Stephen Miller's big congregation
Yes.
facilities?
Yes. Yes. And TSA can help move them. And marshals can be involved. I mean, that's all just within DHS. And those are firewalls and budget restrictions that, under this administration, they're honored. You would never move money you're not supposed to move. They don't play by those rules. They don't play by those rules. It's going to be completely different. The last thing I will talk about for just a second is what can we do? So I think about it in terms of resisting, protecting, and elevating. We have got to resist, we've got to protect, and we have to elevate the stories about how they are going to be harming people, spotlight the kinds of folks that they're going to be taking, not the persons with the long criminal records, but the families that they'll be disrupting. They will arrest heads of households, and then they will say, if you take voluntary departure and you all go, then you can go with them, right? So we're going to see a lot of that, and I think those kinds of stories can be extraordinarily helpful. I think we need to give space to address some of the elephants in the room, some of those policy issues that I talked about with regard to asylum, with regard to the backlogs, with regard to removals. It's hard stuff, but if you aren't comfortable doing it, and I get it, then you have to give space for others to think that way and to talk to moderates on the Hill. We need both and, right? We need the advocates in this room here that I heard you speak so eloquently about asylum seekers. I get it, but we also need moderates that can think about, all right, can we do a case in 6 months? Like, just move it through more quickly. And if you don't have a family member in the U.S., like an identified family member or a sponsor, then you're going to have to remain detained. Those are hard things. I don't even like saying it, and I'm sure now you all don't like me, but that's okay, because that's what I think we have to tackle. The last thing I'll say is that there were over 2 million people that raised their hands in the sponsorship program to sponsor people in the CHNV, right, in the CHNV program. 2 million Americans raised their hand, and they said, hey, we want to do something. We want to help a Haitian. We want to integrate these folks. We want to be sure that they're members of our community in a good and safe way. And to me, that's a demand signal that Americans do still have a big heart, right? That they just need to see that there's control, that there's safety, and that, yes, people want to belong. So I hold out hope. I'm sorry I talked way longer than Kevin wanted me to, but there you go. Thanks, guys.
Great job. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real privilege and an honor to be invited by the Center for Migration Studies and to be on this panel with my co-panelists, the Archbishop and everyone. Let me. I think I'll be brief because I know Kevin wanted to make this panel a conversation. So maybe just I'll share a couple things. First. First, a personal story to hope maybe wake you up, and then a few words about the border because I've heard folks talk. Even this morning, there were some questions or some talk about the border and the perceptions of the border and the idea of chaos at the border has been mentioned a couple times. So maybe just a couple words about that, and then maybe I'll try not to be that person who waxes eloquently about asylum seekers, but maybe I'll do a little bit of that too, and then hand it over to Lee, and then we can have a conversation. I talked to, somebody was having a conversation with the Cardinal about Mother Cabrini. This is the personal story. And so I wanted to talk to him about, I never knew who Mother Cabrini was until I was an adult. But my father always, whenever he needed a parking spot, he would always say, Mother Cabrini, find me a parking spot now. And then one day he told us a story. I thought she was just like an amulet or a talisman or like a magic spell or something like that. And then one day, he was driving to the pub, and he couldn't find a parking spot, so he got really frustrated. And so he said, Mother Cabrini, if you can find me a parking spot, I'll go to Mass every Sunday and I'll give up the drink. And so then all of a sudden, the clouds parted and the sun came out, and then a parking spot opened up, and he said, never mind, I found one. True story. True Irish story, which means it's not a true story. So just a few words about the border. What's happened to the border over the years, and then maybe a couple words on what's happened under the Biden administration, and then what are the real threats under a Trump administration. So in sort of really compressed form, in chiquitito, what has happened to the border? So my wife, she's from Guatemala, and we visited her cousin recently in Nevada. And back in the 90s, he crossed the border in the area of Tijuana. And any Californians here? Anyone from California? You'll remember there's sort of that popular image of the signs that the state of California put on the highways in Southern California near the border of the family running really fast across the road, right? Because people were crossing the highways and they were getting hit by cars. And for me, that's sort of the symbol of migration in the 90s. The graphic designer for the state of California, actually, if you look at it, you'll never forget it now. If you look at the father in that image, he used the profile of Cesar Chavez, which is interesting. When he tells the story, my wife's cousin of coming up from Guatemala, and today he's a citizen. He has a construction company. His two sons, his son and his daughter just graduated from college. When he came up during the years of conflict in Guatemala, his father was killed in front of him. So he goes through Mexico. He comes all the way up to the border, and when he gets to the border, he does exactly that. He runs as fast as he could, and he made it all the way to Nevada. Today, the story on the border is different, though. It's not, of course, the border is still somewhat porous and probably will always be porous because it's 2,000 miles. It's 3 deserts, it's mountains, it's rivers. The terrain is natural and in flux and changing. So there'll always be some degree of porosity, but basically, we've got a really good operational control of the border. We've got like about 800 miles of border wall or fencing. We've got about 18,000 Border Patrol agents at the southern border. We've got the technology, the drones, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a good degree of control. So the story of migration at the border is no longer the story of my wife's cousin, the person running as fast as he could. The story today is a person just showing up. And they find not just those 800 miles of wall, but now if you're in Texas, and Texas is 1,254 miles of a 2,000-mile border. So whatever happens in Texas is pretty determinative for the whole border. And in Texas, they've doubly militarized that wall because now they've got the concertina wire, they've deployed the National Guard, they've deployed Texas DPS, the state troopers. Over the last 2-3 years, they've invested $11 billion in border enforcement through Operation Lone Star. Other states are getting into the act, like Arizona, right? They've passed a proposition in the recent election to also do immigration enforcement by local law enforcement. Texas, we've got laws like SB4. So it's really thick right now. It's a lot thicker. And so the story is simply of someone coming to the border. It might be a man looking for work, but it might be a family. It might be a child. It might be a family unit. It might be an asylum seeker. It might be someone fleeing a contemporary driver of migration that simply isn't accounted for in our current asylum regime. And they're just showing up on the other side of that wall, on the other side of that concertina fence. And so there's a real question that's posed by the presence of that person. And it's a legal question, and it's a political question, but first and fundamentally, it's a moral question. And since the 90s, we really haven't decided as a country what we want to do with that person. We just haven't decided. And we allowed the question to go on for too long. We punted and we postponed and we deferred the conversation. And so then the first time around, 2016, comes Trump. And Trump is the first politician with a pretty damn clear answer to what we do to that person, right? We shut the door, we deport them, we seal the border, we build the wall, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a simple message, but it's an effective message. And now it's back. And it was the leitmotif of the most recent election. Now, let me talk a little bit about, so that's the problem, and we still face that problem at the border, which again is fundamentally a moral question. Let me talk about Biden. So Biden has been roundly criticized, and he's been criticized on the left, and he's been criticized by immigration advocates and people at the border alike, and I think for good reason. But Biden also did a number of things that have contributed to some real stability in a border community like El Paso. When you think about things like CBP-1, for example, again, it's been criticized, and my organization has criticized it. It doesn't meet the needs of everybody. But for a long time, it was really just untenable to have so many people crossing in between ports of entry. It was politically untenable, and it was a logistical problem for Border Patrol. So what happened under CBP-1 was that at least a modicum, again imperfect, and I don't want to minimize the people who were left off the page with CBP-1 and pushed to the margins, but it was an attempt to put in place a system, an order, to have some order and some rhythm and some routine and predictability at the border, so that people who are approaching the border, and we're in that bucket of people who don't have another option, who can't find a safe mobility office, they have a place to go, they have a process by which to apply, there's some screening, and there's a process, imperfect as it was. And many people are going through CBP-1. Today, the average is between 40 and 45,000 people a month are going through the CBP-1 process. So that's a significant number. If it's 45,000 people per month, multiply that by 12, you've got a system that is going at a pretty good clip. Someone else mentioned the CHNV program, the Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela program. That too, which allowed for some of the pressure to be taken off of the border so that people could begin that process from their home country, that was going at a good clip too. Since the program started, I think it's been close to 600,000, 700,000 people that have been able to enter the country through that, which relieves the pressure from the border, at the border, decreases the number, but also allows for there to be a system. Again, imperfect. I've criticized it. It's not perfect. It doesn't meet the needs of everybody, but at least there's something. So there was the beginning of a process being put into place. When you think about the additional pathways, family reunification, for example, they were small efforts, but meaningful efforts. Small but meaningful efforts to increase the number of labor visas, which we need to do more of, because yes, many people who are coming for economic reasons, but that doesn't mean we can't meet their needs too, because it meets our needs as a country. Programs like FEMA, which have been game changers for communities on the border, so that local communities, jurisdictions, governments, NGOs can receive funding to be able to do the work of hospitality, welcome, in a more orderly way so that it's not chaotic. So today, although, again, there are many things about which we would criticize the Biden administration, there has been a sea change between 2016, 2020, and today because of the actions of this administration. So to speak of chaos at the border, there's some nuance required there. And I think that we have to recognize that some of the steps that were taken were the beginning of something. The problem right now is that they're all at risk. They're all at risk. The FEMA, the additional pathways, the modicum of order that we have with CBP-1. And this is why I think it's important to distinguish between good faith efforts to talk about chaos or perception of chaos at the border and bad faith efforts. Because the intention is not to remedy anything at the border. The intention is to sow chaos. That's the point. That's the point. To come in with more draconian solutions or more draconian plans which will ultimately seal the border and bar the way to vulnerable populations that we all want to help. If Biden made any mistake, I think it was this. And you saw a shift as we approached the midterm elections, and you saw a shift as we approached these presidential elections. There was more of an embrace of the logic of deterrence and the logic of militarization, and some of the very policies of the previous administration with the asylum bans, for example. I've got 2 minutes, so I'll stop. But I think the fundamental problem of the Biden administration was this, that he never, at the beginning there was a lot of aspiration and there was a good legislative proposal right out of the gate. But after that, especially when we got closer to election season, President Biden never made the moral argument for why as a country we ought to be welcoming at the border or why we ought to have immigration reform. The argument wasn't made. And there needed to be a strong political argument. There needed to be a moral argument grounded in American identity so that the discourse isn't co-opted by the other side, because that's also what's happened, right? Because now immigration is viewed as anti-American. It's viewed as globalist and elite. The president had an opportunity to make that strong argument, and it was left on the table. And I think we're paying the consequences for that now. I'll stop, but just one thing. I don't think that we can underestimate the damage that a Trump administration could do. It would be malpractice not to plan. The expression is, right, failure to plan is to plan to fail. And so I think that we have to take with a degree of gravity the challenges and the threats before us, especially as a faith community, especially as an organized faith community, and discern together a collective response. Thank you.
Lee, thanks for joining us. Thanks for your patience. Thanks, Dylan. You're on. Sorry for your wait. Huh?
Hey, Lee, you're on mute. Hold on for a second.
You all hear me? Okay. Kevin, I know you guys are running behind a little bit. Do you want to just go into the questions and you could ask me the first question, or what's better for you?
Why don't you give us a little overview of what you see coming and what your
Okay.
strategy is? And then we'll have questions.
Okay, I'll be brief, then I know it's the end of the day. Thanks so much for having me. We are preparing and the ACLU has been preparing since the winter time for a possible Trump administration. You know, I would echo what Angie said, that I think it's going to be very bad, worse than the first term. And there will be some things that we hope that we can stop in court, but not everything. So I really think it's going to require multiple types of action. One is going to court, and I'll briefly touch on some of the things that we're seeing being talked about and what possible legal challenges there may be. But the other part is just a national effort to push back. And I agree with Angie again here that a lot of people want to see immigration reform, and we also want to see immigration reform. And the public seems to want that overwhelmingly. But I do think that there's a difference between sort of abstract notions of immigration reform and what really happens on the ground. I think we saw it the first time around where the first Trump administration thought they could do anything to immigrants, that they had dehumanized them to such an extent that anything goes. And then they did family separation, and you saw enormous pushback, not just from Democrats, liberals, but across the ideological spectrum, political spectrum, from the Pope on down. And people said, well, wait, we want, some immigration measures, but we don't want little babies ripped apart. So we are not going to be able to stop all of the deportations, as Dylan said, and everyone's, acknowledged. But I think if there are military in the streets, if there are indirect family separations by deporting parents with little U.S. citizen children, leaving those children behind, or forcing parents into that excruciating choice of leaving them behind or taking them with them to a country the child has no connection to. I'm hopeful that people will push back. We need to document those instances and make it clear to the American public that this is what's being done in your name, because I think any civil rights lawyer will tell you that there's a limit to what you can do through the courts, and it really needs to be people speaking up and saying, this is not what we signed up for. On the legal front, we're hearing, including today, that they're going to try and use the military to engage in deportations, and specifically the Alien Enemies Act. Our view is that the use of the Alien Enemies Act to engage in deportations would be flatly illegal. It's only been used 3 times in our nation's history, the War of 1812 and both World Wars. It requires either a declared war or an invasion or threatened invasion from a foreign government. That's not what immigration is. This is not being done by a foreign government. This is not an invasion. So whether the courts will allow the Trump administration to do it or not, or view it as a political question, remains to be seen. But I think we're gearing up for that type of legal challenge. the Trump administration saying they're going to use the National Guard, though it depends on how they try and use the National Guard, but there are potential legal challenges. But I think we may see things that are not as splashy, but just aggressive use of ICE officers in neighborhoods, maybe deputizing local officials. Those may not lend themselves to sort of per se legal challenges. We may be able to challenge them on grounds that there's profiling going on or Fourth Amendment violations, but there undoubtedly will be harsh deportations. It looks as, and I don't think, at least from what people are saying, that it's going to be limited to just the most severe criminals. So people are going to have to document those stories, because ultimately nothing moves the needle except human stories. And the American people need to see, well, this is the type of immigration reform that's going on. They're talking about birthright citizenship, taking away birthright citizenship for children born on U.S. soil to undocumented parents. We believe that's illegal, and gearing up for that type of legal challenge. There's going to be the use of expedited removal type procedures in the interior. We've challenged that once. We didn't prevail. I don't know, there may be some additional challenges to that, but those will raise difficult legal questions and maybe difficult legal challenges, and that's going to cause, I think, really mass hysteria if they're picking people up in the streets and saying we can summarily deport you as long as we declare you to have been in the country less than 2 years. So I think all those things are going to be happening. We are worried about them trying to start up family separation again. The ACLU brought a suit during the first administration that blocked that, and now we've entered into a consent decree with the Biden administration that blocks family separation for the next 8 years. We don't know if the Trump administration will try and attack that directly, but they may try and do family separations indirectly under the radar. And so we're going to need lots of information from people on the ground so we can go back to court and say they're circumventing the settlement. So I think there's just an enormous number of things that are potentially going to be done by the Trump administration, many of them novel and draconian, and we will challenge what we can challenge. But, again, to reiterate what's already been said on this panel, it's going to take more than the courts. It's going to take a national effort by people saying, look, there's a line over which we won't let the administration cross, and we're going to come back and take to the streets peacefully like we did with family separation and push back, because I don't think this is going to be something that only can be done through the courts to push back on it. It's going to be harsh, but we all need to document it and speak up. So maybe I'll stop there because I know that time is short, and hopefully I can stay for a little bit of the question and answer. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Lee. Really appreciate it. We're pushing it on time, so we're just going to go straight to the questions and answers for those who have questions. And we'll have the conversation that way.
I just wanted to, the documentation of all abuses are going to be so important, but I'm also wondering if there's a way to make sure that we are educating all of the legal service providers that do this work on the ground, and community organizations across the country in a very systematic way, so we're all taking the information that's going to be necessary for your work.
You want me to take that, Kevin, or?
If you want to, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I'm fine. You just call on me when I would just say the point is an excellent one that the questioner is asking. And I think that's exactly what we're in the process of trying to do, how to figure out how to coordinate so that all the information gets out to groups on the ground and there's coordination so people know who they can call for legal advice, for information, because it's not going to work without coordination. So I think, I think we're maybe a little, at least I am not sure actually how far along each community is in each state, but you're right, that needs to get done, and there needs to be a sense of urgency about that, because that's going to be absolutely critical.
I mean, I had just a couple things. I honestly don't believe that the Trump administration is going to exercise prosecutorial discretion. I mean, I think Angie's totally right about that in terms of its interior enforcement, right? I mean, Homan is the one that said everybody should be afraid, and he's the guy that he's listening to at this point, and Stephen Miller too. The other, And remember about Trump too, like, he said he had a great love for the Dreamers. People forget that. Oh yeah, I have a great love for the Dreamers. We're going to try to do something for the Dreamers. That was what he said at the outset of the last time. So you can't really trust what he says, and he's not saying it this time in any which way. This is my question. I get the point on the bureaucracies are overwhelmed. There was heavy volume of people coming to the border, all of those things. But what I'm not quite sure about, and I don't doubt that there's organized smuggling that's going on at a degree of sophistication that we've never seen before, et cetera. But this is what I am wondering about. Is there really evidence that there's of massive fraud in the asylum system? In other words, really kind of people coming through and being denied at extraordinary high rates because of things other than the fact that most of the appointees of immigration judges right now are Trump appointees. I mean, there might be other explanations. The only evidence I've heard of that is that whatever the congressman said, there's a low percentage when they actually do adjudicate the cases that are actually getting asylum. But it could be that there's just a hell of a lot of asylum seekers because they're coming from places that are asylum generating places. So I'm not really not necessarily disagreeing with you, Angie, but I'm kind of wondering, as somebody that was in the administration, you have good intelligence on that? Or does anybody?
There were, without a doubt, people who were being coached about what to say. There are people who don't have strong cases because, as you know, the burden of proof to win asylum is really high. And I think that there is a very well understood reality that if you come in, you can be in a backlog and you're not going to be adjudicated, your case, for 5, 6, or more years. And in that time, people do what everybody does, right? They fall in love, they buy a house, they work, they have children, and then it becomes just immensely more complicated at that point to remove them. So I think until there is a greater clip at which cases get processed so that people aren't here long enough to put down those kinds of roots,
I guess I'm totally with you on that. Absolutely, you're totally right about that. But there's always been some fraud. I just haven't seen, if it existed, some great evidence that there's massive fraud in asylum cases. It doesn't seem like there would be, given where people are coming from.
Even if there's not fraud, we don't know if there's fraud because we're not able to process the cases for all these number of years. I can tell you, every morning when I was in government, I would wake up and the first thing I would do is look at my email and I would get the report from the Border Patrol about the number of encounters from the night before. And their numbers were shooting up, right? 7, 8, 9, 10,000 encounters a night. Do all those people have legitimate asylum cases? I don't know, but I do know that our government can't possibly process them.
That's absolutely true right now. We can't process them. I just don't know if the other part of it's totally right.
Well, it's a high burden of proof. I wish it weren't so hard.
Right.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up for the day.
This is a question for everybody in terms of, I think with Trump 1.0, we did a good, a lot of groups came together to speak out against all of the harsh policies. And, people came to the streets as to the children being torn apart from their parents. But clearly the message just completely disappeared, I think, and people ignored it with Trump 2.0. What measures do you think we can take more proactively to make sure that the values that we're trying to resonate, as we tried with Trump 1.0, we could take for Trump 2.0, so hopefully we don't get back to Trump is not the only issue, right? It could be another, Miller can run for, I don't even want to say it. But my point is, what did we do wrong, or what did we do not as well as we could have done so that everything that worked for a few years didn't disappear and then this person got reelected again.
Well, I think the intervening 4 years, we saw a sea change, right, in how immigration policy was carried out because of enforcement priorities that really were trying to remove only current public safety threats and national security threats and more recent border arrivals. So, I mean, I just think that the terrain shifted really very quickly, and people have amnesia, and I just don't think that people thought he would win again. I did a lot of scenario planning, and everybody who was in all these scenario planning meetings was like, holy heck, it happened, and it was a sweep. He has a trifecta. And the Supreme Court, I mean, Lee knows better than I do, it doesn't look the same. So we are on our back heels. But I do think that because we've had 4 years of relative calm and success, that we do have people that are those sponsors. We have policies in place now at the state and local level. That gal from NCSL talked about a lot of those. I mean, we have other people who can speak to the value and the success of creating lawful pathways for people, right? Like, you have to have both. So I think it's going to take, though, seeing really ugly things to happen, and then we'll have the next wake-up call. But until then, I just think there's a lot of hand-wringing.
But he's also a lame duck because he can't run for a second term. So that puts some guardrails on the thing.
Right, but he has a 40-year-old vice president.
Yeah, I know. I
He's
don't.
40, he's a puppy.
Can I ask one last question to the Archbishop and Dylan and Angie, if you want to?
Yeah.
What's the role of the church in this? I mean, the church has members who Trump is targeting. They're going to be sitting in your parishes, and I'm waiting for the bishops to speak out strongly against this plan, and I haven't seen it yet. So anyway, I challenge you there. What's the role of the church in this, in the end? I mean, in trying to prevent all this?
Well, we'll do what we've always done, sometimes better than others, but other times. But we have in place our clinic, Catholic Legal Immigration Network, that goes throughout the country. We have people on both sides of the issue in our pews as well, and so hopefully the bishops will continue to lead with a bully pulpit. And one of the, they talk a lot about the bishops of the United States being divided over different issues, whether they're for Francis or against Francis and everything like that. But the one issue that the bishops are consistently united on, is immigration. We're on the side of the angels with immigration. We have always been. We might disagree about liturgy. We might disagree about a whole bunch of other things. But when we passed Strangers No Longer, it was almost unanimous. So, and that's been pretty consistent. And that's 20 years ago that we passed Strangers No Longer. So I think, I think you should know where the bishops and the church are as far as immigration goes. And really, 50% of young people, 50% of the people under 30 that are Catholic are Hispanic. In other words, they're either immigrants themselves or children of immigrants. So that's the reality of our church today. The first, thing that we're going to, and it might seem a little bit self-seeking or self-serving, is the mess that has been made with the religious worker program. Mess by the Bidens, basically, or by the bureaucracy. And if we can get that straightened out, that'll be a great, that'll probably be the first item of conversation that we might have with the incoming administration. But what else?
I'll just say, and I think to answer your question about why it's been so challenging and why it might be a challenge going forward, and then maybe how the church can respond, I just think Trump is incredibly gifted at flooding the zone with bombast, and we've become numb to it. And that will be a challenge, I think, even going into the administration. Our inability to grapple with the urgency of this right now, I think, is that numbness that comes from having flooded the zone with so much craziness that we're simply numb to it. I think in terms of the church, as the Archbishop mentioned, with Strangers No Longer, the church has a wonderfully beautiful, deep tradition on which to draw on. And I think now is the moment to make that solidarity real. There has to be real, effective solidarity shown at the local level. And I think our vocation as people of faith and as a faith community has to be that we are close to the pain. All of you, almost all of you, work in agencies across the country that put you directly in the vicinity of the pain. And then partir del dolor, to begin to plan, to act, to respond, having felt that pain. I think that's the evangelical vocation right now, to be close to the pain. And then, as Pope Francis says, to make that solidarity effective and practical, and walk with and alongside folks who are in pain.
When I was working with the Haitians as a young priest, people would always say, well, what are you supposed to be doing? What are you trying to do? And I said, my task, I said, my mission is twofold. One is to make the church visible to the Haitians, and the other one is to make the Haitians visible to the wider church. And I think that's really, the task of the church here with this immense number of new Americans or new immigrants in our country. In too many places, they're invisible. They were invisible in Springfield, Ohio, until they started talking about the missing ducks and cats. But there's a city in Ohio that had one priest and 4 parishes, and they said 15,000 Haitians. They should have had those Haitians could have filled up a parish or 2. So make the church visible to the immigrants, and the other side to make the immigrants visible to the wider church.
Terrific. Well, thank you to the panel. Let's give them a big.
Thank you for hanging in there.
And thank you, everyone. That concludes the symposium. Thank you to Fried Frank for hosting, and have a wonderful evening.